A brave new world is happier, wealthier, and wiser than the world we live in today. Shruti and I are incredibly proud to propose. Briefly on the model, I think it is reasonable to say we have fiat to do it in a better way than Huxley's famous novel did. That means people are going to assign the role at a relatively early age. They are going to be aware of that which they are genetically engineered to be good at. This does not necessarily mean it is correlated with class. That means it's not just professors' kids who are genetically breeded to be professors. We think we get a reasonable amount of fiat to say it is diverse and so you get meaningful amounts of opportunity intergenerationally. Secondly, we think guaranteeing physical access means guaranteeing equal access to food, equal access to healthcare. People are going to be able to afford this. We are guaranteeing social stratification that you cannot literally move up and down classes, but everyone's physical needs are met. Firstly, why do we get better, happier lives? We think the status quo is irreversibly unhappy for 4 reasons. Firstly, people operate on the hedonic treadmill. That is, every single time things get better, you always benchmark against that success, so you don't think ever things are better. This is why everyone says the status quo sucks. The 2010s were a terrible decade, even though objectively it was wealthier than the decade before, because people benchmark against the things they already have and no longer actually feel those happiness after a very short period of time. Secondly, you benchmark against your
point of information.
No thank you. You feel that you are doing very good in an objective global sense. You see everyone else appearing to do better, therefore you feel terrible about it. Even if you're wealthy by global standards, only people your social capital is relative to appear to be doing better, often because they put on a happy face for things like social media and to others, so you always feel worse. Thirdly, there's always
information.
You can do better, because you can always see the people who are doing better than you, so you always feel deeply insecure, even if you are doing well, that it's possible to do better. Maybe you lose in world semifinals, but you feel bad because you think you could have gotten to finals. Fourthly, no thank you, you're constantly insecure about meeting your physical needs. People are constantly worried, and the overwhelming majority of people, will I be able to afford medical costs? Will the ache of lower back pain, the existential dread that you might get cancer in the future, the constant fear of where will my next meal come from, how will I be able to put a food on the table or a roof over my head, condemns people to constant worry, eliminate on our side of the house. Why do we get better? We think we eliminate all those things because you know that you are in the best place in your life. You are born to do these things.
On that point,
that which you are best on, you no longer fear about these things. Secondly, you have a greater focus on the important things in life. We think where people truly get their joy from, the overwhelming majority, are things like their family and their friends. It is easier to focus on these things if you are at peace with your other choices in life. That you're not constantly worried when you're over with your family that you're not going to be able to put food on the table for them, or that you're not in the best career. You can focus on the things that matter, like loving your spouse or loving your kids, when you're not worried about everything else in life. They may respond in 2 ways. One, that you might not have a feeling of accomplishment. We think for the overwhelming majority of people, they don't have that right now. They mostly work 9-to-5 jobs in white-collar or blue-collar careers. They do not provide those feelings of accomplishment. Maybe they eliminate it for the very, very lucky few at the top. I don't care. Secondly, they may talk about how you cannot change the social order. Shruti and I would argue you cannot change the social order right now. In the overwhelming majority of countries, the rich dominate politics. In the United States, they donate billions of dollars, which is how Mike Bloomberg has managed to buy himself 7% of the Democratic primary. Social cues and classes mean, even in more enlightened countries with a reasonable campaign finance system, the kids of professors are the ones who end up being professors. The kids of bankers are the ones who end up being bankers because they're cultured to do the things that they are from a young age, so they always have that advantage. We don't think they get to change the social order, and there's the house. At the very least, they'll have to establish how they can do so. No, thank you. Secondly, we think we stop self-destructive behavior that condemns the overwhelming majority of people to worse lives. These look like 4 things. 1, people engage in things in antisocial behavior, or things like gangs as a means of self-protection. We do not think they have that if your physical needs are met. Secondly, people engage in heavy temporal discounting if they think their future is bad. They engage in things like unprotected sex or other kinds of bad decisions, like maybe not going to college even if you're qualified to do so, because they don't have that in things in the future. That heavy temporal discounting is eliminated in our side house. Thirdly, we think people do not take risks in their personal life because they feel insecure. They go to careers like consulting or finance or big law and lose all of their personality and interests because they fear that they can always do better. But now they don't have those things. They can engage in their other kinds of interests, and they can do art and other things they truly enjoy because they know that it's right for them. They don't have that insecurity that maybe instead of doing that art, I could be grinding for that case study or selling out the BCG at the Deputy Prime Minister. Fourthly, we think that people mindlessly scroll through things like Facebook, they drink, they procrastinate all the time to take their mind off life's hard choices. They waste the overwhelming majority of what little free time they have because to introspect or do art or anything else requires them to inspire about the choices they made. We eliminate that kind of doubt. So we give them and open them up the mental bandwidth to engage in activities they truly enjoy with, thus massively expanding the horizons of lives of the overwhelming majority of people in Western liberal democracies. Closing.
So your solution to deep existential angst is the government indoctrinating these individuals into becoming slaves?
Yep, that's the case. Second independent argument, we get a far wealthier and more innovative society. 2 reasons. 1, we guarantee the physical needs. In fact, this huge amounts of talent is wasted all the time because they're malnourished, knowing headhunters can't find them, they're in a poor family and not given the same opportunities. We eliminate that in our side house, we guarantee physical needs. But secondly, people can focus on the things that are best and specialize at young ages because they know that's what they're best for. Thirdly, they are literally genetically engineered to be good at the things that they are doing, so you have perfect labor matching, right? There's a huge amount of inefficiency right now. People are in the wrong fields that are actually best for them. We guarantee
point of information.
Thank you. We are genetically engineered to be in the social rules and be in the social order. This means we can solve the problems that are ruining society. There is a very real risk. Climate change might kill everyone in this room. The best minds right now are going to higher paying fields like finance and consulting. Now we guarantee that literally the people genetically designed to be climate scientists are going into climate scientists, perhaps producing the kind of solutions that might suck carbon out of the atmosphere, get other kinds of green technology, and decarbonize their sectors. They need to engage with maybe a dynamic, liberal democracy in which people can express their values all the time, but then they literally just die, or it's just poorer because we don't have the kind of technological innovation that raises productivity and can put food on the table for literally everyone. That is something they engage with in their side house. Finally, we think we get better lives to the poor on two levels. One, we guarantee meeting physical needs. This is probably, we should care about helping the poor and the most disadvantaged the most. One, at some level, they are the ones who need the help the most. But secondly, if we believe that there's a diminishing marginal utility to getting money, that is, if you have $5,000, getting $2,000 means a lot more than if you're a millionaire and getting $2,000. Considering this, guaranteeing the physical needs of the poor probably outweighs the lost feeling of accomplishment of those who generally are already feeling accomplished. But secondly, people right now blame the poor for their own feelings. They see that it is their own fault. But now that everyone is socially conditioned to accept the world that they're in, they no longer blame people for not getting ahead because they know that this is merely the job that was assigned to them. They don't look down on people who are of different professions that they may not believe have the same social capital because they know that wasn't their choice. This is what they were genetically designed to do so. This means it is far more palatable to support things like treating people of different social classes with respect. It means it is far easier to justify things like redistribution if you no longer feel that it is responsible of their own choice. It is merely the lot they were given in life. We think the status quo is very bad. They are likely on opening opposition, being an overly rosy pace. We think a brave new world lifts people out of these existential ennui that condemns far too many people to insecurity and unhappiness. We are incredibly proud to propose.
We thank the Prime Minister and would like to call upon the Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, no matter how bad the world is in Western Liberal Democracies right now, no person owes their life and their body to others, and especially not to an oppressive state, because they do not have the fiat to say that the state will be a perfect actor that will make the most rational choices and just do things that are good for everyone. We have seen states that have this level of coercion and power abuse that time and time again. They do not get to fiat out human nature. We think that this will just become a more oppressive world, a world of slavery for the majority. We're going to bring two things in opening opposition. First of all, how this takes away autonomy and why that is a harm that they cannot get over, even with all their benefits. Then we will deal with the debate on inequality. So let's first of all deal with the idea of autonomy. Because insofar as that side tries to paint a rosy picture and say, you'll be happy because you'll be doing the thing that you know you were best for, that does not mean you are doing the thing that you want to do, panel. That does not mean you are doing the thing that brings you the most fulfillment in life, by virtue of the fact that, as they say, there are people in the status quo who have the ability and have the means to do all of these things right now, and they choose to not do that. They choose to do something else that makes them happier. We think that this is a particularly important thing for people to feel good in society. We think that under their world, there is no control over your station in life. You are purely seen as an instrument of the state, and you are reduced to a function rather than being a person. You are created to fill a specific social need. We think that takes out all the value of being a human being in the first place, of doing all of those things, of getting any of the sort of value. So even if you're doing something that you would have possibly chosen to do anyway, if you are doing that because you are forced to do that and because you are just a mechanism of the state, that takes away any of the value that opening government asserts that you would get out of that. The second thing is, we actually think that there'd be less innovation under their side, not more under their side, for a few reasons. Because first of all, these people may be meeting these basic needs, but they're not being met in a fulfilling way. They are not getting any enrichment from that first point that I proved in this. But let's juxtapose that to the status quo, where you do get a growth and a growth of products networks that are starting to meet those needs. That it's not just the basic needs that are met, but people are able to meet those in diverse ways, because the basic needs of everyone are different. And under a system where people are able to choose and demand more, that is where you get those sorts of things. What we actually see on their side is therefore a lack of any culture or identity, because the state does not have an incentive to create a market for all those sorts of things. They have a market, they have an incentive to just socially engineer you to accept your lot in life and accept what they are willing to give you. That takes away culture, that takes away identity, that takes away personality, which leaves people feeling entirely devoid from society. The last thing is that people are obliged to others as a tool of the state, and the state has an incentive to use that to keep people down, because the state will still want to maintain its power on people, and so they have an incentive to strip that autonomy as much as they possibly can. We think that people have historically privileged autonomy over so many other things. We'd point to Syria right now, where people are fighting a war that they know they are likely to lose. It is likely to make their life materially worse, but they are willing to do that because they will prioritise freedom over any of those other things that open government wants to talk about. Before I go on, I'll take closing.
You are born into the constraints imposed by society from which your preferences emerge. Tell us how this is materially different. Tell us where your preferences come from in the first place. You have to give us some genealogy.
Scale though, right? Like, yes, people are somewhat coerced into things under the status quo. You give them literally no way to do that. People under the status quo can go against the norms, and people do transgress those norms, and historically have always done that. That may be a slow progression, but it does give people that choice. You literally give them none, so it is far more oppressive than any sort of culture we have in the status quo. Let's move on to the idea of inequality in this debate, because we think that this is going to still have the exact problems that opening government tried to avoid in this debate. They try and tell you that no one will think lesser of anyone. They absolutely still will, because people are still naturally filling different jobs, and those jobs will necessarily have a different status for three reasons. One, because some of them will just be seen as more interesting than others to the majority, and therefore be seen as more prioritised and better jobs for people to have. Secondly, because some will just have greater social utility. So someone that is doing something that's like saves lots of lives will still be seen and privileged above someone that does not do those sorts of things. But finally, because they will require different capacities, because people will be required to be more intelligent than others, and they'll be specifically under their side engineered to do those sorts of things. So insofar as I want to say no one will think lesser of anyone, they absolutely will for those three structural reasons. So and any effort that the state makes to message that will fail, and also the state does not have an incentive to message any sort of equality, because they still have an incentive to keep a social hierarchy in this debate. Let's move on to what the state's incentives are, because this now gives them a huge amount of both social and economic control over everyone, because by virtue of that side, they need to be redistributed, they need to take a lot off people, but also they get to engineer people the way that they want. That gives them the ability to entrench themselves as the apex in the community. They are the ones that are likely to therefore make sure that their children are engineered for the jobs that come with more status, that are likely to go into politics or things like that and be the next decision makers to entrench these sorts of social hierarchies that exist in the status quo. It gets a lot worse though, because at least in the status quo, we have the ability to break those norms, and there are the abilities to protest and break free from that. Under their world, there is no ability to move against those norms for people who have been engineered to be less intelligent, who have been engineered to be lesser, to break against that and get any of the sort of capital that they want. A few harms on this. The first one is violence. We think that the inequality that this necessarily creates, the hierarchy that it creates, and the inability to escape it through any other sorts of means like we have in the status quo, like the ability to engage in politics, like the ability to do things like engage in education and try and get yourself up a rung on the social hierarchy, means that these people have no alternative but to try and fight this system with violence, which we think makes that society descend. Like a very simple fact that Beach told me is that airlines that make people walk through first class first, those people in economy class are 5 times more likely to engage in violence when they're on that plane because of the politics of envy that creates. Let's juxtapose this. I don't know why people are sitting in economy. Anyway, let's move on to the second harm. So let's compare that to the status quo. The status quo is unideal, we concede that. But first of all, there are trends to improve, and there have been historic equalizers. Things like recessions have been an equalizer that have been able to bring people more away from the extremes of wealth. The government world, that is stunted. The second is we have the capacity to move between classes on our side. They do not have that. The final thing is, as I proved in my first point, their world is one without culture and one without identity. At least in our world, even if it is unequal, you are able to find other things that you value in that world, and you are able to commit yourselves to those, rather than just having to dedicate yourself to being yet another cog in the machinery of the state we are proud to oppose.
opening opposition's case is like a stack of donuts. They build it up higher and higher, but there's still a gaping hole in the middle that takes them out of the round. The fact is, there is no objective measure of well-being. Things have value because we put value on them. In Western liberal democracies, like the ones most of us live in, we value things like autonomy and culture and identity. But we value those things because we are socially conditioned to value those things. Because governments tell us those are the most important things. Because our parents tell us those are the most important thing. The POI from closing opposition is deeply uncomparative. We're fine with indoctrination because indoctrination is the status quo. We are just indoctrinating people into different things. When you are born, you are indoctrinated into the values your parents espouse into you and to the propaganda that your government releases. We're just indoctrinating people in a way that makes them happier and not deeply insecure and uncomfortable with the lives that they are living. So I think we're fine with that. So all their harms about, people are going to be upset because they really value autonomy is just a problem with the status quo. People will no longer value being able to do whatever they want to do or being like accessing autonomy. Unclear what this is, by the way. Free will isn't real. You're like controlled by like the neuro impulses in your brain. Unclear whether they're like going to prove the existence of a soul in the DLO. But I think to the extent that autonomy doesn't exist and indoctrination is the fact, I think we take them out of the round. What we do eliminate is the plaguing self-doubt that comes from the mismatch of what you are indoctrinated into and the status quo on their side of the house. We're fine with indoctrination because we are indoctrinating people into what is the reality. It is the case on our side of the house that there is no, there's little autonomy and there's no movement in the social ladder, and people will accept that on our side of the house because they are conditioned to think that that is valuable. On their side of the house, we're conditioned to believe in the American dream that you can get whatever you want to get. We're conditioned to believe that you have unequivocal autonomy, but this isn't actually the case. And so people are plagued by self-doubt and imposter syndrome. People blame themselves when they cannot rise out of poverty. We blame ourselves when we cannot do something that we are not genetically engineered to be good at because we think we should be able to be good at it even if we are not. Why do we win the round? First, I think they never engage with the bulk of material that Will tells you, which is that people are just happier on our side of the house. Unclear what the value of culture or identity or autonomy is, if not to make you happy. We think on our side of the house, given that expectations reset and that you benchmark yourself to relative to your peers and you benchmark yourself relative to the past, people never get any happier on their side of the house. But I also want to note that you always feel like you could do better. So even if on our side of the house there are people who are living in worse material conditions or in lower status jobs than others, they don't blame themselves for that on our side of the house because they do not think it is their fault that they cannot rise up. And others also don't think it's their fault that they can't rise up. So you don't get conservative politicians blaming the poor for being poor because it's clear to everyone that they're genetically engineered to be poor, so they don't deserve to live in worse conditions just because they're worse people. Closing.
Why is utility morally significant?
I think utility is morally significant because it is the only universal calculus on which we have to assign value to things. That is, it is unclear what other metric you could use that is universal across all people, except for the things we ourselves place value onto.
On that point.
No. Next, I also think we just want to say that we eliminate the plaguing self-doubt that most people are plagued by. We allow people to still access happiness and freedom in other ways. People still have freedom to choose their friends and their family. People still gain value and meaning in life from those relationships. They're just not plagued by the sort of self-doubts we are on our side of the house, like you aren't worthy of whatever you're doing, or that you're doing something wrong because you're not deserving of doing that thing. We think we let people focus on the important things in life. Next, what do they tell you? They say, you're taking away autonomy. I think we already dealt with that. The things people want to do are created by social cues in the status quo. Our social cues are that what you are doing is the thing you are supposed to be doing, and thus the thing you want to be doing. Then they say, innovation never happens. I think first Will proves to you that the society on net is just a lot wealthier and also a lot more redistributive, given that we fulfill the burden that is not met by the status quo. That is, everyone has their material needs met, so it is a lot wealthier because people are doing the things they are most optimal to do when they are genetically engineered to do it. We are the only ones able to confront the literally existential threats. There is absolutely zero utility or anything closing opposition wants to derive any value of if we all die from climate change in the next 20 years because the permafrost is thawing and releasing methane into the air, heating us all up, and there's nothing anyone can do about it because everyone who's smart enough to do it is locked into this bottom half of the social quintile and can't go to fancy universities. Then they say, but the state is going to keep people down because you still think lesser of other people. fine. We're fine biting that there are some jobs that are more interesting than others, or some jobs that produce more objective value for society than others. That is also true in the status quo. I think the comparative is now individuals do not measure their self-worth by their occupation, which is not true in the status quo, but also that others don't measure other self-worth based on it. So maybe you think that someone who is a rocket scientist is more interesting, but you don't think they are deserving of better things, or they have inherently more value of a person because of that, because you know that the state genetically engineered them to do it like you to do it. The lottery of birth is a fact in the status quo, but the sort of propaganda that governments release, like the American dream, leads people to believe that that is not the case. On our side of the house, everyone is aware of the reality of the lottery of birth, and so we actually make steps to resolve it and don't treat people who are lower status than us like garbage because we think that they deserve it. Then they say government and elites just further entrench themselves. So I just think it's ridiculous for us to have to defend the actual the worst case of this model. I think we'll give you reasons to believe why we can be relatively egalitarian and not just make the children of the rich be genetically engineered to also be rich. But I also want to point out that I think we're a lot less likely to get violent or destructive behaviors on our side of the house. They say, now the poor have no alternative but to fight. But if, when you turn to violence, you risk your life and livelihood. Maybe your life isn't as good as those on the top, but at least on our side of the house, your material and physical needs are being met. So you're probably not going to put your life on the line just to access a little bit more wealth, given that you're contented with what you already have. What's the weighing here? First, I think we prove that we better access the most objective measure of well-being, that we actually give people happiness and don't let them be plagued by self-doubt. I also think we satisfy the burden of giving people materially better lives to the extent that this is something that's important. We actually fulfill the burden of the poor. I'm from a nice suburb of Chicago. There are people 30 minutes away from me dying on the streets, and there is nothing anybody is doing about it. Maybe norms are changing slowly, but clearly not fast enough to save people's lives. Unclear why we can depend on that when we can just actually save people's lives and make people happier. On our side of the house, there is a principled harm being done by the status quo. We are not fulfilling our obligations to others because we don't believe in the validity of the lottery of birth. On our side of the house, we actually do that. I think we're proud to propose because we give people better and wealthier lives.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister and would like to call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Are we good to go? Dom explains that in this world, you are barely a person anymore. You are brought in not as a person, but as a cog, and then expected to mindlessly grind. Your traits are determined not by you or by the happy accident of your unpredictable birth, but instead by a state who has already predetermined everything that you ought do. You should be free to be yourself. And I'm not a genealogist, but I believe that people are agents with rights and entitlements, that they deserve the capacity to act on in the way that they feel the need. Opening government's focus on every other value except for utility as subjective is one that is profoundly self-defeating, as is immediately obvious in the sense that there is nothing obviously good about the fact that you experience, serotonin or endorphins, and we point, in fact, to tests. Circumstance in which the rubber hit the roads, in which a wide number of people who resonate deeply with all of us as valuable and not making clearly wrong choices chose to prioritize considerations other than their material considerations. Revolutionaries, saints, mothers and fathers, people who did things not because it necessarily made them happy, not even necessarily because it made them fulfilled, but because it made them free and dignified. And that is the case that we bring you, that they dismiss exclusively by talking about serotonin. I'm going to begin by talking about that principle, and then I'm going to talk about inequality. But before I do, I'll take closing.
Autonomy only matters insofar as it fulfills your preferences. If your preferences are
there are a number of responses to this. The first is that in Western liberal democracies, the state does not control a majority of your preferences, because the literal point of a Western liberal democracy is that people are able to make choices on the basis of various inputs. The second thing to say, obviously, is that it does not necessarily matter per se where preferences come from. The thing, like for example, right, if you have, and we cannot quite explain where they come from, appendages like arms, just because you did not choose to be born with arms, the use of those arms, just because your arms are predetermined by other things, does not mean the exercise of those in material conditions subsequently is worth no value, right? The fact that one thing is not obviously attributable to something that is exclusively chosen by you does not mean that your subsequent exercise of choice is something that is not valuable, closing government. The third thing, but this is the trick, because the premise of this debate that is uncomparative for the government bench is that under the status quo, people are able to exercise their preference. Our belief is that people will still feel the same needs that humans feel, because it is our belief that people who have lived under indoctrination have continued to hold the beliefs that inhere in the human condition about the value of their autonomy. You cannot erase that, Mr. Speaker, and we tell you that with reference to people who died under torture rather than give up their freedom, or even the people of freedom that they had never known, or the freedom of people that were born. You cannot erase that fundamental component of human condition. Opening government overrates their fiat so badly that they would make us no longer human beings, and that is why they are wrong. Let us talk about the principle in this debate. No, thank you. We tell you that this inheres your ability to make choices in a way that we recognize as making you a person. It would be profoundly wrong for states to be complicit in that state of affairs, and it would be a wrong world. The only thing that the Deputy Prime Minister says is that you are able to make some other choices. Firstly, you can make far, far fewer of them. Secondly, the choices that they describe, like the goods of family, will obviously be socially predetermined for you to a huge degree, as we tell you with our... Well, because now, right, you probably have like a barcode or some understanding of the amount of alcohol that was put in the vial to make you intelligent or dumb, right? And so you're obviously only going to be in a relationship with somebody that is predetermined to be at a similar level of intelligence to you, right? Like kind of trivially, because there are going to be overwhelming social hierarchies that tell you that those things are good or bad, and that you should, as a result, adhere to those. So then, the POI that we get is what is the comparative? And we tell you two things. Firstly, the society in flux is not able to coerce people nearly as powerfully as a society that is never able to change. And secondly, that birth is highly unpredictable, which often means that people break from the expectations that their parents have for them and are able to make their own choices. The opening opposition then gives you four things that might be improved, but we explain how those things are in fact made substantially worse. They describe a problem of benchmarking, but the problem of benchmarking, the impulse to engage in that, still exists, and it only gets worse in the context in which you are incapable of improving but are constantly benchmarking yourself against other people in the setting. They say that you now see other people as better or worse than you, but now the difference is that instead of needing to go on Instagram, and instead of it being about your choices that are hypothetically changeable, you look at the amount of alcohol that was put in your vial, or you look at the role that is given to you by the community, and that gets worse. They tell you that you feel the emotion of anxiety under the status quo. That is of course true, but the comparative is a sense of profound numbing dread, and we tell you that that is worse. Firstly, because anxiety is at least a motivator to make the changes that allow you to enjoy your preferences. And secondly, because anxiety is at least life-affirming, because it involves a reminder that there is something that is worth losing. Finally, the opening opposition describes a variety of self-destructive acts, like enjoying drinking too much, or, various sexual acts that cannot be described in this university campus. And of course, so, not to, offend people, but obviously those things are interesting at least, and you have a life filled with more diverse sets of experience. Finally, on inequality. Firstly, on climate change. In the first instance, this motion does not include developing economies, and the trajectory for developed economies is already reasonably good, so it is not clear that this harm is particularly large. Secondly, it is not necessarily clear that, given that we entrench inequality because people that are making the choices will be the high IQ ones, presumably the state planners, they can insulate themselves from consequences. They never gave you a reason that these people are likely to act extraordinarily selflessly. And thirdly, their material about economic growth on which this is hung is wrong, because a state-controlled economy does not properly communicate information to people about what prices ought to be, and does not allow people to innovate outside of their individual instances of capacities. Instead, it locks people into individual boxes. They then tell you that their mech of politics is that it will get more equal, but we tell you that the capacity for inequality fixing is weaker, because now you know for sure that inequality is fair, because you made everyone to fit in the individual social classes, which means they deserve it far more. This strips people of everything that we understand about humanity. And that might be subjective, but I don't care, because I care more about personhood and I care more about people's choices than anything else. And that is why I am so proud to oppose.
We thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition and would like to call upon the member for the government.
Before we start, I want to thank my high school debate coach for watching the live stream, and on behalf of Mission Arth, I want to thank their high school debate coach who's sitting on OO. Is everyone ready? Love you, Don. Cheers. The reason opening opposition says people protest against indoctrination is because under the status quo, there is an asymmetry between the state to whom you yield your autonomy, even if not in preference construction, but in the vast majority of things, and the heterogeneous preferences of people. It is a problem which comes from democracies being preference observing rather than preference determining, and then fulfills them without actually understanding what people want. Under our side, the change is very simple. The state is your sovereign, and the sovereign purposes your autonomy to your maximal good. I want to be clear about the reason top half's debate is incoherent. Maybe you believe the utility monster claims that you get from opening government. Maybe you believe the autonomy claims that you get from opening opposition. But they are irrelevant, because what opening government fails to do in this debate is prove to you why happiness is a moral good that exists in and of itself, rather than being constrained by autonomy. This is something that Mish points out in POIs, and I want to be clear that this is where we win. So, how does the extension happen? 1. In the status quo, you have preferences that are set up and constrained. OG hints at this after we pointed out in a POI, which they didn't take at the PFC, but you are born into a family that inculcates you with norms, society imposes constraints on what you do, and culture is deterministic of preferences. OG touches this without explaining why it is morally relevant or salient. The issue is twofold. 1, the preferences that you have are not observable by the state. That is, even in the best case scenario, the state has no visibility into the preferences that you make, regardless of where they come from. But 2, your preferences are at odds with other preferences. And I want to be clear about the opening opposition model about, like, what happens if all of culture gets removed. I think it's actually a good thing. Like, the problem is that the cultural preferences that you're imbued with are things that allow you and set up competition against each other. Like, the only reason people care about cultural identity in the ether is quite literally because those are the norms that suggest there is competition between cultures, and the only way that you can reconcile that is by prioritizing cultural identity. I think on close in government, we're actually quite fine with saying culture should not be the benchmark by which you dictate what your preferences are, because that is always and permanently competitive. Here's what I want to be clear about before I go to the second part of the extension. You always surrender your authority to the monopoly of force that the state has that cannot observe your preferences, which means you surrender your liberty without a guarantee that you are actually able to make the most fulfilling life possible. So what is the second part of this extension? It is that morality is built on preferences. The only reason we care about morality and the only reason we care about autonomy is because it gives you the capacity to fill preferences. Opening opposition is like, you care about autonomy, like you guys said this, it's not important on your case, it's important on ours. Opening opposition is like, people are saints, they revolt. All of these things seem to be extensions of what people have preferences for. Like maybe it is true they don't crave serotonin or dopamine, but they certainly have preferences from doing the things that opening opposition says. The only reason we give freedom of speech and things like that is because it allows you to rail against the state. Where then does morality emerge from, and why is this morally significant? It's things like grief. That is, scarcity means that when you take something and when you have something, you take something from something else, someone else. It is security that requires power under their side. It is the paranoia of the state taking your resources, meaning that the way that you construct morality is in checkbacks against these things. And most importantly, it is preferences born out of competition that requires a lack of fulfillment of some people, because you being fulfilled and your preferences being competitive with other people means that they are not fulfilled. Here's the issue. Opening does not answer the claim that happiness is not a moral good if it is not autonomous. I'm going to be clear about why this is salient. Because democracies and the status quo, best case for them, Western liberal democracy, intends to be preference fulfilling. But the problem is the system is born into tension when it can only observe and not determine. And I think this is important because the reason our side is not coercive is because the imputation of coercion is something that it dictates and distorts your preferences. But to be clear, democracy is fundamentally agnostic as to where your preferences come from. And I want to be clear about why the POI to LO matters and why the response of scale doesn't. Because the POI is, maybe it is true that some preferences are a priori, something that opposition can identify where the source is, but why ought it not be true that the state that you already surrender your autonomy to, but can never observe preferences, is now responsible for dictating them and constraining them? The OO response of, but it's about the scale. Right now you don't have one person dictating your autonomy is perfectly fine. Because even if it is a small collection of lots of different things that impute and change your preferences, democracy never interrogates where those preferences come from under the status quo, which means the distinction we make to how you get your preferences is literally morally agnostic. We don't care about this. And I think DLO actually concedes this argument because they say, quote, it does not matter where your preferences come from. There's literally no morally salient difference between whether they are imputed by the state or imputed by any other collection, which is something that opening opposition fails to actually respond to. Why do we solve this? One, because we change the alignment between the symmetry of the state and your preferences. That is, to maintain power, the only optimal strategy is quite literally to do lots of things like fulfill what you want. The reason the state doesn't want people protesting against indoctrination is exactly the reason they do what we said in the model, which is they fulfill your preferences. But more importantly, this is the only iteration of any possible state that can actually get your preferences correct. Because any other version of the state, in order to be purely preference observing, in order to maximize what people actually want, that is what Western liberal democracy cannot do. And the reason you find disagreement in Western liberal democracy right now is exactly because it fails to do that. I'll take opening.
Our material on inequality demonstrates that the state has both incentives and enormous non-pre-existing capacities to coerce people and retain power without satisfying the set of preferences
inequality
is their optimal.
Okay, number one, guys, the motion literally says you satisfy preferences. I think that's fine. But number two, inequality, in this response to the best case of opening opposition, inequality is born out of competition with others. And this is what we actually solve. Because removing scarcity is a massive win, and being able to fill people's preferences in these cases is a massive win. Think about the way that you get inequality on their side. It is not in a vacuum. There are people that say, I'd like other people to be unequal. It is literally things like cultural wars that cause ethnic identities or individuals that assign value to their class over their pure preferences that say, I want to discriminate against other people. Why? Because those people being able to access their preferences imputes the ability of me to access my preferences. The fact is that metrics like culture and benchmarks like that are exactly what keeps people competitive in the status quo, which is how you get inequality on their side of the house. I think if we remove if you remove the bad metrics that people observe, like culture, we are fine saying that increases the ability to fight actual inequality. What else does opening opposition give you that just isn't salient to this debate? They talk about things like innovation that are born out of things like anxiety. I think on our side, we just get lots of people that are genetically specialized in doing better forms of innovation, which means if you think that resources are important, climate change, things like that, that's what we fight, because we want to make sure that your resources are protected. At the end of this debate, top half doesn't matter, because they give you no morally salient questions as to why this is the actual morally legitimate claim to the best form of the state. We solved that. Very, very proud.
We thank the member for the government and would like to call upon the member for the opposition.
Can everyone hear this? Cool. If the only way to save Aditya's life was to enslave me and Arth in perpetuity, even if that would have led to net utility gain because Aditya is alive, I would still think that is a fundamentally illegitimate thing to coerce other individuals and instrumentalize them for the ends of others. 2 prongs of extension from closing opposition. Why this is a state that fundamentally enslaves all of its citizens, engaging with closing government and explaining why that is the most morally salient point in this debate. And secondly, I'm going to be the first person on op bench to talk about liberal democracies and why they can actually meet all the benefits that opening gov want to talk about. And the implication of that is if we can mitigate all the benefits of opening gov and we can prove that autonomy is meaningful, then when you weigh that off, given that we can access all their benefits, the debate falls to our side. So why is this a state that ultimately enslaves all of its citizens and is morally significant? Realize first of all that no utility has intrinsic value. Utility just doesn't exist in a vacuum. That would just be like metaphysically weird. Like, why is an apple valuable? It's because I think I like it and therefore I assign that apple value. Therefore, if you recognize that utility only exists because a human will wills that utility to exist, we realize that nothing is intrinsically valuable and is determined by individuals' human wills. And the implication of that is very important for the opening government and closing government case, because it flows from that therefore, that given utility construction is constructed by the human will is itself the most important consideration in this debate, even if the human will has been conditioned to value certain things. Because it doesn't matter if the human will wills what they want to be valuable as valuable if you constrain that valuation process to begin with, because it is that valuation process itself that is the most morally salient point in this speech. So we can agree with both OG and CG that social conditioning is effective. The problem is, even if social conditioning is effective and people value what you want them to value, that is in and of itself a constraint of the human will. And given that the human will is what all utility flows from, it is irrelevant that you make them believe something. The fact that you are making them believe it in the first instance is bad, even if you can satisfy those preferences. And flowing from that premise comes 2 independent principal claims from opening opposition. Given that the human will is most important, social conditioning in any sense, even if you can fulfill the preferences you socially condition into them, is immoral, as it constrains the human will from assigning that value in the first place. And even if you can fulfill the preferences that you then make them, that they then believe in, it is illegitimate because you've prevented what is most valuable from occurring, which is that valuation process to begin with. Because given that utility is not in and of itself valuable, the only thing that can be valuable intrinsically is the thing that constructs that utility. So even if you construct it for them and fulfill them, that is not legitimate because you are constraining that process of creating that value to begin with. But secondly, this instrumentalization is bad, right? Because you cannot use me to benefit others. Because if a human will is what utility comes from, then utility cannot be traded off as values on a number sheet. You cannot kill me to use my organs to save the 8 people in this room, even if we create utility on net. Because the human will, being the construction of all utility, means that the source of utility for every individual person in this room is different. What makes me, me, and what I preference is different from what makes Arth, Arth, and what he preferences. Therefore, even if you increase net utility, it is illegitimate to instrumentalize individuals to that end. But the third thing I want to note under this principle, and this is very important because it rises above the autonomy stuff, even if you don't believe it, is that individuals can no longer consent to this state, period. Because recognize that states fundamentally coerce individuals and they give up their rights and they prevent what they could otherwise do in the absence of that state. Note what social conditioning and genetic conditioning does on their side. It makes these individuals a tool of the state for the roles they want and for the things they want to do. What this means in reality is individuals can't exit that state because they've been programmed genetically, they've been programmed socially to always want to stay within that state. And this is not just about autonomy, right? This is literally what you can and cannot do, irrespective of the social preferencing that happens. It's whether or not you can do certain actions because they're illegal or legal. What changes on our side is obviously Obviously, this doesn't apply to everyone, but individuals are able to exit a state. Many individuals are able to exit states. They can move to other countries. They can move to other systems of law and can actually consent to legal systems and frameworks that they want. So, given that on their side, social conditioning prevents the evaluation process to begin with, and that evaluation process is most important, what happens in liberal democracies on the comparative? No, thank you. We think even if norms exist, like, people can resist those norms, right? Even if you grow up with parents that inculcate you with values, you're exposed to media, you're exposed to friends, you're exposed to other narratives that exist in society as debates occur. There are countercultures that exist to the primary culture. You are able to access different types of narratives and therefore resist it. Furthermore, we're living in an increasingly socially mobile world. We get access. Like, you can't use the US as the worst case example of all Western liberal democracies. Like, we are increasingly moving towards welfare systems. We're increasingly moving towards systems that account for the preferences and needs of individuals worldwide. This means, therefore, that in liberal democracies, you are far better able to access that of what is most important, even taking opening government and closing government at their best, that you can fulfill the preferences that you create within individuals. But I don't even think they can do that, and this proves all of GovBench, right? Because what Aditya says is that you can control what people believe, and therefore you can fulfill those beliefs. But I don't think at any point in OG or CG do they prove the efficacy of the social conditioning process. Because realize what happens here. There's a black box, you have inputs, and the output is the mental state. What they are controlling is the inputs of genetics and social conditioning. The problem is there are other exogenous factors, I'm dealing with that right now, that they cannot control. Because even if you can socially condition to some extent, there are almost an infinite amount of variables that influence the way people perceive their lives. There's injustice on the ground that people perceive, what they love, what they hate, what they grow up liking, the family they grow up in. Because even if you socially condition them, you cannot control all these factors. And this is important because it resolves the gridlock that Aditya mentions. Because what this means is that even if the state is the one conditioning things, there are still other things that are influencing you. And the problem there is you can never resolve that deadlock. And you can resolve that deadlock on our side because there is open debate. There are cultures and countercultures. On their side, you simply have these experiences that contradict what the state tells you. But the state is the overriding force, so you never get any of the benefits GovBench want to talk about. No thank you, Arthur will take two. Secondly, why are liberal democracies good at meeting everything opening government and closing government want to claim? The first thing to note is you get maximal information on our side, so you're best able to get exposure. People are less racist, people are moving towards better welfare systems. And critically, every electoral cycle, there's an untapped base which you want to tap into for the next electoral cycle, so liberal democracies converge to representation and getting everything in the long run. We're moving towards greater expansion of welfare and the provision of basic needs for everyone. There's a strong rise of charities and other organizations to maximize these for everyone that is left behind. We get almost all the benefits we want, and for the reason I think opening opposition give, you don't solve climate change since the developing world still exists anyway. And note the comparative here, right? This is a prefers a world motion, not a this house would motion. They cannot fiat the best possible iteration of the Brave New World. So in the construction of the Brave New World itself, it'll be constructed by the individuals who are most in power and therefore the most elite. Given we give a mechanism for convergence of liberal democracies to representation, we beat them on that comparative, since the most likely emergence of this Brave New World is one that is dictated by those in elites in power right now, whereas on our side, we converge to the representation of everyone. At the end of that, we get all the benefits of GovBench, and it's not worth trading off autonomy. And even if we don't, we have proven why autonomy is morally salient, even if they can make those preferences to begin with. For all those reasons, closing op wins.
We thank the member from the opposition and would like to call upon the government's whip.
Comp. Cool.
Ready? Panel, if we have to give you a pill before you are born to like the state, we will do it. The power of this motion is that we can quite literally form your preferences. And what Bobby never answers is why autonomy is good in and of itself. Because we claim to you it is an instrumental good to fulfill your preferences. If your preferences can be predetermined by the state, then your human will is predetermined by the state. Because what they never tell you about the human will is a set of preferences which are internally constructed to external stimuli. So, if we're able to preset your human will, we're able to align your human will with the autonomy you forego to the state inherently by being born. That question hasn't been answered, and you cannot let the whip get away with trying to answer it at the end of CO. I'm going to deal with closing opposition and a dismal lack of response. On opening government and living in praxis, which this debate just was not about, and then opening opposition, who said that autonomy is good because autonomy is good, and you see martyrs and stuff, so that's good. On closing opposition on enslavement, they tell you that nothing is intrinsically valuable and the human will is most important. A few responses. 1, we agree, but this conditioning happens before the formation of that will, because that will is a response to an external set of circumstances. They give you no response to family, to religious doctrine, which exists in the formation of that will. We don't believe that babies in and of themselves have a human will, which is why we don't confer them determinative rights as individuals. That will is formed once they're able to rationalize that. We happen before that rationalization process, which is why we are determinative of that will in the first place. Second of all, at their best, even if it is a priori, they can't explain where that human will otherwise emerges from. Maybe it comes from God. Maybe it comes from genetic Darwinism. By their logic, your birth is then enslavement. We would rather that be a preference-fulfilling form of enslavement, where the enslavement you feel to the state is one which actually makes you feel happy. Okay, secondly, on principles, they say you can't instrumentalize the human will, which is a lewd assertion. 1, this only stands when the human will is already established. We told you this happens before establishment. 2, the comparative is that you have to instrumentalize your human will because of scarcity. That is, your preferences are in competition with other people, which means you need other people to fulfill your ends, which is why you instrumentalize them in the first place, because it is an irreconcilable competition. There is heterogeneity of preferences, and the state to whom you yield your autonomy cannot fulfill your preferences. Then they say you can't consent to the state. 3 responses. 1, why do you ever? You're born into a state with ideologies. Even if you can move, you're constrained by the history of that state, by the history of the world. You're constrained by other people's preferences, which are in contestation with your own. But second of all, you already forego your autonomy to the state in virtue of being born. You're not born in a state of protest. You're born in a state of servitude because you yourself have not developed your rationale as a child in the first place. But third of all, and this is really important. We tell you that you can consent to the state because now you know the state is preference fulfilling, and therefore the trade-off you make to a democratic state, which definitionally is a preference aggregating and fulfilling state, is now a fair trade-off because you know they can account for your interests. That scarcity doesn't mean that something that you give to someone else has to be at your cost. It is that resolution of the tension that Bobby does not respond to and Arth cannot resurrect in his whip. On opening opposition, 1, on innovation, they tell you that, 1, we tell you that we make people better at particular forms of innovation. 2, we give you preemptive importance that is placed on resources being given to everyone, which requires massive innovation to presume this allocation in the first place. Second of all, on the politics of envy, 1, we are fine doping you up with your disconsent. There's no reason why envy is worse than the status quo of dissatisfaction. We would actually say that envy emerges from deep dissatisfaction with the status quo, and envy emerges from the fact that your preferences are in tension with one another, which means that you envy someone else being able to use their power over you. Realize that the purpose of power is quite literally to enslave you, because you only require security insofar as your preferences are in tension with someone else. So if they strip you of resources, you are suddenly in a compromised position. Again, never resolved by them. Second of all, competition happens along preferences, and this cultivates envy politics, as I said. Third of all, on autonomy, this extension is responsive. That is, we only care about your autonomy We only care about your freedom of movement. We only care about your freedom of speech to express a set of preferences against the state that is currently refusing those preferences. So now, if the state is able instrumentally to observe those preferences in the first place, it solves the problem of this debate morally. And OG try to give justifications which aren't moral, that is, that the state is able to make you happier, but they don't tell you why happiness is in and of itself a necessary good. That is, we tell you that happiness from preferences is good because it is formative of your autonomy in the first place. The reason you exercise your autonomy is because you want to live a good life that aligns with your preferences in the first place. They never give you this genealogy, which is why we beat them.
On a point of information.
3 reasons why democracies are not perfectly preference observing. First, I'll take Beej.
Do you think it would be morally legitimate if you were able to condition someone such that one of their genuine desires was just to be your pet?
Actually, if you condition it before the human will is formed, I actually don't see why this is morally problematic. Like literally, if you live your entire life in consistent appeasement, if you live your life without having that will distorted, because realize the premise of this POI is that it distorts your will in the first place. But the premise of our case is that we are formative of your will, and therefore your will wills you to be a pet. So if you want to be a pet, go live your life, be a pet under our side. We already let people to do this under the status quo. Again, there is no moral push which is significant under this. Why are they not democracies not preference observing under their side? 1, voting is something people often feel apathetic about because they know that their preferences can't always be assumed by the state. Under our side, they are. Second of all, your vote is often based on in-group biases over internal preferences and having to make trade-offs between your internal preferences. We don't force you to make these trade-offs, therefore this is not a constraint of your autonomy. At the end of this speech, one thing should be clear. Your autonomy is an instrumental good to your preferences. Your will is formed a priori by us, and your preferences are in alignment to the state you now confer your rights anyway. So the state has a monopoly of power. You don't have any force as an individual against that state, but in collectivizing, we resolve this tension uniquely under our side. An asymmetry that is born from your autonomy being heterogeneous, we instead purpose the state, your sovereign, your God, to fulfill your preferences. So proud to win.
We thank the government whip and would like to call upon the opposition whip.
Bluster certainly isn't a substitute for analysis, and that's why closing government is out of this debate. And the reason for that is what we tell you is that you can in fact preset the human will under their side, but we tell you that is bad, and they don't give me a reason to suggest that it isn't, other than to demonstrate an intuition pump that the status quo is one in which your human will is preset and enslaved to begin with. But that never engaged with the actual comparative that the opposition bench set up, which is, this is not about madrasas in Pakistan, this is about Western Liberal Democracies. We have access to information, we have access to exposure, we have the free manifestation of that human will. That means Abhinav's analysis as to why the free operation of the human will, or the freer operation of the human will, giving the basis to all morality is important in this debate. Because our comparative, which gets no response from closing government, by the way, talking about response, means that that morally significant metric, your capacity to choose what your preferences are on the comparative stands. That is why closing government on a consideration of responsiveness is out. But that's also why OO collapses in this debate. Because firstly, there's no reason why autonomy is more important than what OG tells you, which is happiness. Beej tells you, yeah, you can be a dad and that's a good thing, but we demonstrate why that operation of autonomy is important. Because it underlies every valuation of utility to begin with. That is uniquely a gridlock breaking argument that Abhinav comes up with. Secondly, there is, and I am just genuinely baffled. This motion has Western liberal democracies in it. opening opposition don't talk about why Western liberal democracies are good. They assert that there's some economic trajectory. Abhinav demonstrates at every point why there's a convergence to accommodating preference, why individuals are able to make the choices opening opposition's case is reliant on. Therefore, the key contingency in this debate dies. Lastly, we demonstrate on a consideration of weight, deep existential dread, because they can control some of the inputs into your mental state. And the fact that Mish doesn't respond to this is just absolutely terminal for that case, because it is true that you can control social conditioning, but you can't give them a fucking pill in like 2000 BC. The mechanisms of social conditioning are largely the same, but even if you could, you can't control the way that your experiences, that your family, that your communities emerge. And in order for closing government's claim to be true, there needs to be an absolute alignment between what your experiences and desires are and what the state wants. But Abhinav demonstrates that's not likely to be the case, because your experiences do change, which means if CG's case is that there is now the case, stop coding your POI, sit down. If there is the case that, for example, you have to have a perfect alignment between the state and people, it isn't the case anymore, because the state still has to operate on observed preferences, because they don't know what's on your head. In your head, they can only control some elements of your mental state at any given point in time. So this ludicrous extension dies. I'm going to do two things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about OG, the team of death, destruction, and despair. Then I'm going to talk about closing government, the team that'll put you in cages, give you food, and call it a happy life. Let's look at opening government. This case collapses on a consideration of characterization, because it is literally, this state is good. Western liberal democracies are bad. Therefore, motion. And the problem with this is that it is an utter assertion from opening government as to why it is the case that this state would be good, or why it would be the case that the elites dictating how this society manifests would be good to begin with. We give you an Abhinav why it wouldn't be the case. The bias, the initial circumstance, the perverseness of people keeping down on the basis of difference does not change. They don't give me a reason as to why that's the case. If you're a rocket scientist on opening government, you still think that the work you are doing is more valuable and important than the people that you think have been selected by the state to do the cleaning job. There's no reason why you would engage in that allocation they talk about. But most importantly, we demonstrate that that allocation wouldn't be random, because if you are the white people to get the resources to do this in the first place, your perception is still that brown people are tribalistic and ought to be socially conditioned in a certain way. So it's not even the diverse way they talk about. Weigh that against the trivial observation that Bobby has as to why Western liberal democracies are quite good. Because they just assert, well, in the US, we have bad campaign finance reform. That's bad. As opposed to, we will pick black people and make them cleaners permanently because we have no capacity to change the social orders. My God, this case just fucking dies in this debate. Therefore, what you have to weigh in this debate are the marginal improvements at best in physical material, which are marginal based on Abhinav's analysis as to why Western liberal democracies are improving in efficiency, improving in representation, accommodating more people, versus enslavement, a lack of resolution, and all of the instrumentalization Abhinav tells you. That is why opening government is unambiguously out of this debate. OG.
Yeah, OG's been strong in it to include monster people. Our teachers bring up mental and physical bandwidth, focus on genuine choices of fulfillment, allow people to genuinely self-actualize more than the status quo. It's just all strong.
Yeah. But that's predicated on you proving that the status quo is bad, which you assert, and that this model is good, which you assert. You do neither of those things. That's why your case dies in this debate. Let's look at closing government, the team of cages. And I want to be clear here. Abhinav did respond. I'm sick and tired of people saying that he doesn't, because this draconian extension is again predicated on the manifestation of the state being good. Because at best, Mish proves that there is some capacity for the state to engage in the perfect alignment of incentives and preferences. Like, they can do this, but he never explains why they will do this, and we demonstrate why they're unlikely to, because the construction of the state is predicated on those individuals that do that. And Abhinav tells you that, ironically, to no response in Mish's speech, but most importantly, and it is terminal for this CG, that we give you a piece of material that destroys this claim, and there's not a semblance of response to this. The experience claim we gives you demonstrates that closing opposition is not meaningfully able, through the state, to bridge the gap between individuals' preferences and what they provide. Because if it is the case that experience meaningfully changes your preferences in a way that the state doesn't have epistemic access to, then the bridge that their case is reliant on considering does not occur. Compare that to the comparative, what Abhinav tells you. Western liberal democracies that actively seek out your preferences because that's how they get votes. They ask you, they have an incentive to do this, as opposed to a state where the social structure and hierarchy can never change. That is the comparative in this debate. So if it's about bridging the gap, the trajectory material we give you as to how best that gap is bridged absolutely decimates this claim. At the end of this speech, I want to be very clear. This is tantamount to enslavement and instrumentalization. The key value is allowing for the freer operation of the human will, because that is the only thing that is morally significant in this debate. Very proud to stand in closing opposition.